The South African Border War, a conflict that spanned over 2 decades, yet remains relatively unknown to many. This war was not just a series of battles fought on the dusty plains of southern Africa, but a complex geopolitical chess match played out on a global stage, right in the heart of the Cold War. From the late 60s to the late 80s, the South African Border War was a fierce and brutal conflict, fought primarily between South Africa, supported by the United States, and Angola, backed by the Soviet Union. Yet its significance often gets lost in the shadow of more publicized conflicts of the era, like Vietnam or the Middle East crises. Why is this war often overlooked, you might wonder? Part of the reason lies in its geographic isolation. Tucked away in the southernmost part of the African continent, the war was far removed from the world's media centers. Moreover, the strict censorship policies of the apartheid South African government kept much of the conflict hidden from international view. But the lack of global attention does not diminish the war's importance. The South African Border War was a critical theater in the Cold War. It was a war of ideologies, where the East and the West clashed not on their own soil, but on the battlegrounds of Africa. The conflict had profound implications for the region, influencing the course of history for countries like Namibia and Angola. The war was also a human drama, marked by tales of bravery, tragedy, and resilience. Thousands of soldiers and civilians, from different cultures and backgrounds, found themselves caught in the crossfire of a war that was as much about global politics as it was about local issues. Now that we've set the stage, let's delve into the early battles that shaped this war. The Battle of Ongulumbashe, a skirmish that ignited a war that would last for 23 years. In the remote northern reaches of Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia, the Battle of Ongulumbashe occurred on August 26, 1966. This skirmish, often disregarded in the annals of global military history, was the first major military engagement of the South African Border War. A conflict that would stretch over 2 decades, pitting the South African Defence Force against the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, an armed wing of the Southwest African People's Organization. The Battle of Ongulumbashe was far from a grand spectacle of traditional warfare. It was a tactical engagement, a chess game between the opposing forces. The South African Defence Force sought to cut off the People's Liberation Army from its supply lines, forcing them into a corner with their backs against the inhospitable terrain. The People's Liberation Army, on the other hand, employed guerrilla warfare tactics, utilizing the dense bush and the rugged terrain to their advantage, launching surprise attacks and quickly disappearing back into the wilderness. This was a strategy born out of necessity, a means to combat a superiorly armed and resourced enemy. The battle ended with the South African Defence Force gaining the upper hand. The People's Liberation Army, outnumbered and outgunned, were forced to retreat. However, the battle was far from a decisive victory. The spark had been lit. The first shots of a war that would last for 23 years had been fired. In the grand scheme of the South African Border War, the Battle of Ongulumbashe was but a small encounter. Yet, it was this battle that set the stage for the brutal and protracted conflict that would follow. The strategies employed, the tactics used, and the lessons learned would shape the course of the war in the years to come. The Battle of Ongulumbashe marked the beginning of a long and brutal war, setting the stage for the battles to come. Operation Savannah, a daring and covert South African invasion that escalated the conflict. In the early days of the South African Border War, the conflict took a dramatic turn with the launch of Operation Savannah. This was the first major South African operation of the war, a covert incursion into Angola that would dramatically escalate the conflict and shape the course of the war. Launched in late 1975, Operation Savannah was a reaction to the increasing influence of the MPLA, a communist-backed faction in Angola, on South Africa's northern border. South Africa, feeling threatened, decided to intervene. What started as a covert operation quickly evolved into a full-scale invasion, with South African forces penetrating deep into Angolan territory. The mission was not without its challenges. The South African forces found themselves in unfamiliar territory, facing a well-equipped and determined enemy. Yet they pressed on, seizing key towns and infrastructure on their path. This aggressive push, however, stirred international attention and condemnation, adding a new layer of complexity to the war. Operation Savannah was a game-changer. It marked a significant escalation in the conflict, transforming what had been a low-intensity border dispute into a full-scale war. The operation also had far-reaching implications. It not only intensified the fighting, but also drew in foreign powers, with both the Soviet Union and Cuba stepping up their support for the MPLA. The operation, however, was not an outright victory for South Africa. While they managed to seize substantial territory, they were unable to completely eliminate the MPLA threat. The operation ended in early 1976, with South African forces withdrawing under international pressure. Despite the withdrawal, the impact of Operation Savannah was profound. It set a precedent for South Africa's involvement in the war, establishing a pattern of bold, large-scale operations that would define the conflict in the years to come. Operation Savannah signified a turning point in the war, escalating the conflict and setting the stage for the fierce battles to come. The Battle of Cassinga, a clash of ideologies that pushed the war to new heights. This battle, taking place on the 4th of May, 1978, came to be known as one of the most controversial of the South African border war. The South African Defence Force launched an airborne attack on the town of Cassinga in Angola, targeting a SWAPO base. But Cassinga was not just a military base. It was also a refugee camp, home to thousands of Namibians fleeing the war. This dual nature of the target made the battle a contentious issue, with both sides telling starkly different stories of what transpired. The South African account claimed a successful strike against a major enemy base, a blow to SWAPO's military capabilities. They argued that the civilian casualties, regrettable as they were an unfortunate consequence of SWAPO using refugees as human shields. On the other hand, SWAPO and its allies painted a picture of a massacre, a brutal attack on a refugee camp with little military significance. They claimed that the South African forces knowingly targeted civilians, an act they used to rally international support against the apartheid regime. But the Battle of Cassinga was more than just a military engagement. It was a symbol, a microcosm of the larger ideological struggle of the Cold War era. South Africa, with its capitalist and pro-Western stance, was pitted against SWAPO and its socialist allies, including the Soviet Union and Cuba. The battle lines were not just drawn in the sands of southern Africa, they were etched into the fabric of global politics, reflecting the ideological divide that had split the world in two. The South African border war was not just a regional conflict, it was a proxy war, a battleground for the world's superpowers to assert their influence and propagate their ideologies. The Battle of Cassinga demonstrated the global implications of this regional conflict, revealing the ideological battle that was at the heart of this war. The echoes of this clash still reverberate today, a reminder of a time when the world was divided, not just by borders but by ideology. From the first shots fired at Ongulumbashi to the ideological clash at Cassinga, the early battles of the South African border war set a precedent for the conflict. In the silent corners of history, we find the South African border war, a conflict that, despite its obscurity, left an indelible mark on the sands of southern Africa. The opening shots at Ongulumbashi ignited a war that would span over 2 decades, with roots embedded in the complex web of Cold War politics and the fight against apartheid. Ongulumbashi, often considered the spark of the border war, was a battle of firsts. It was the first major engagement between the South African Defence Force and the People's Liberation Army of Namibia. The skirmish, although small in scale, set the tone for the war, revealing the fierce resistance and resolve of both sides. Then we moved to Operation Savannah, an escalation that demonstrated the war's growing intensity and the increasing involvement of foreign powers. This operation, a failed attempt by South Africa to halt the spread of communism in Angola, highlighted the broader geopolitical stakes at play. It was a stark reminder of the war's place within the larger Cold War context. Next, we delved into the Battle of Cassinga, an ideological war within a war. This battle, a brutal clash between South African paratroopers and Cuban forces, unveiled the ideological underpinnings of the conflict. It was not just a territorial dispute, but a clash of political beliefs and values with human rights and freedom caught in the crossfire. Each of these early battles in their own way shaped the course of the South African border war. They were the building blocks of a conflict that would continue to echo through the corridors of history, serving as a stark reminder of the human cost of war and ideological divide. While the South African Border War may not be as well known as other conflicts, its impact and the lessons it provides are undeniable.